It's good to see you. It's good to see you. And welcome online. Lovely to have you online. And you might be in the living room, so enjoy where you are with your cup of coffee. And it's good to see you. Great. So today we're finishing off this series on touch. And like with so many of the other ones, you know, I started delving into it and then realizing there was just so much information on this. And I'm going to say something at the beginning. You know, there's the 5 senses we have, which is sight, hearing, smell, tasting, and then touching. And apparently touching is a mother of all senses, and I will explain that, okay? So it is a sense that's more important than anything else, apparently. You know, you can live without sight, you can live without so many of the other senses, but if you're not touched, you really struggle to survive. So actually touching is one of the most important senses. And you know, it says you can live without oxygen you can't live without oxygen and water. And they say if you aren't touched as a human being, if you live in isolation, then actually you will really struggle to survive. And oh my goodness, this season of isolation we find ourselves in, how true has that been more than ever? So we're going to have a look at all those different things. You know, it's been interesting, the huge rise in mental health in this country. We always knew there was an issue with mental health, but mental health has actually taken off during this whole season of isolation. And I think it's because we're not just even physically touching people, but you know, sometimes with living in isolation, you actually are living, you know, without touching people. It's interesting, you know, I remember at the beginning of lockdown, we would put on our masks and we would go for a walk, as we were allowed to walk once a day. And you would be going for a walk, and when people saw you, you know, they would jump out of the way and, you know, part. It was like walking, you know, the ways would part and people would go to cross the other side of the road if they saw you. But I thought to myself, how interesting, we've got masks on, but we can still speak. And so Ian and I made a decision that every time we went out for a walk, we would say, hello, how are you? And speak to people. And people were just almost frightened. And I thought, you know, how crazy it is that a mask has almost shut down so many of the communications. And actually through this season of lockdown, you know, maybe we can't physically touch people. Maybe the rule of 6 has come in. Maybe we can't get to people's houses, which is all the guidelines, and we want to adhere to them. But we need to keep in touch with people more than ever. They keep speaking about socially distanced, but I think it's a wrong term. We need to be physically distanced, but socially more connected than ever. And if we're not socially connected, that's when fears and isolation really creeps in a huge, big way. So our sense of touch, it's amazing that the word touch has come so much into our vocabulary. You know, you'll hear about people speaking about losing touch with people. Okay, that's when you lose connection. If you're staying in touch with people or being connected with people, you know, in touch, you speak about touching base. Oh, I need to touch base with someone. You know, someone has the common touch. They're able to get alongside someone and have the common touch and come alongside everybody. That often is referred to somebody in royalty or someone who's quite well, and they have the common touch. They're able to come right alongside and have a conversation and mix through all the different levels of society we have. There's the easy touch and the soft touch, you know, what kids are like. They find the parent that has the easy touch and they play on it. You know, we talk about the finishing touch. You know, you're doing something and there's the finishing touch. You want to put the finishing touches on to making a cake or decorating a room or whatever, you know. So there's so many times this word is in our language. And I wanted to see, what does the Bible have to say about touch? You know, a few times you've heard me referring to Helen Keller. She was an American lady who lived in, I think she was born in 1880, and she was born totally normal little girl. But when she was 19 months old, she had an illness that made her blind and made her deaf, and because she was deaf and blind, she was totally dumb and she wasn't able to communicate. And she speaks about later on she lived to be a lady who was about 88 or something when she passed away in 1986, in 68 actually. But she lived, and she said that her whole world shrunk down, and this little girl, you can imagine a little baby of 18, 19 months old, just suddenly having no senses, nothing. And she said her world was dark, and they treated her like not a vegetable, but she couldn't do anything. So they fed her, they cleaned her, but they couldn't communicate with her, and she just kind of existed. And when she was 7 years old, a teacher came into her world, and a teacher came in, I can't remember her name, I think it's Anne Sullivan or something. There was a film made of her, and she came in and she looked at this little child and thought, there's more to this little child. I'm going to see what I can awaken in her. And I'm just going to read it. It says here, when she was 7 years old, this is her biography, she said, her teacher opened up to her the power of touch. It was almost like a conversation experience, it says. She says she went from darkness to light, from silence to language, from dumbness to speech. She loved everything that her fingers touched. And it said the power of touch changed her whole history and her whole destiny. And this teacher took her outside and put her hand underneath the water fountain, and she felt the water, and then the teacher signed out WATER singly on her. And then she gradually worked with her. I think water became her first word. And she started introducing her to things where she just lay in a bed vacant. She started introducing her to things, and suddenly her world came alive through the power of touch. And it said that when she learned how to speak, she would put her hand on someone's vocal box and feel their vibrations, and her hand on their lips to see. She learned how to lip read through putting their hands in someone's mouth. Just the power of touch totally awakened her. And so I just thought how amazing that this woman who had this awful trauma happen to her, that she then became an amazing advocate. And, you go and read up about her. It really is fascinating. It's wonderful. So that was her. The power of touch changed her and allowed her to change many lives. There's so many different studies. I can remember being at university and hearing different studies, and there was a study done in 1940. And there's so many have been done that actually are so traumatizing. I can't believe they did them. But there was a study done on the importance of touch. They had 2 control groups of babies in an orphanage. This was done in the 40s. And one baby, they said to the nurses, you feed them and you change them, and that's all you do. Can you imagine? And the next set of babies, they said, you feed them, you change them, you cuddle them, you play with them, you handle them, you massage them, and you speak to them. And then after, I don't know how long passed, it must have been months, a year or something, because some studies went on for 2 or 3 years. They then looked at the control group, and then they looked at the other group. And the control group, it said they were... they weighed less, and they were subdued and just had nothing. And the other group blossomed, and they gained weight, and they were interactive, and they giggled, and they had speech, and they talked and everything. And it just shows that the power of touch, the power of communicating, awakens more in a person than just, we need more than just food and water. We need each other. It says in the Bible at the beginning, when God made Adam, and he went down and spoke with him every day, and he would walk in the garden, and they would discuss the trees, and hey, what did you name, and what did you think of this? And they would have a conversation. And then one day God thought, you know what, it's not good that he's on his own. He needs to communicate more than just communicating with me. He needs to communicate with other people. And he made Eve. We were born for connection. We were born to touch each other, not just physically, but with our mouths and everything else. So Jesus, what did he do? He touched so many people. He picked up little children and put them on his knee and bounced them and blessed them and told them stories. He was in the synagogue one day. He saw a lady bent over, and he touched her, and immediately she straightened up. He went to see Peter's mother-in-law, and he touched her hand, and the fever was gone. He touched the blind man. He put his fingers into the ears of the deaf, and he healed them. He picked up the hand of a little lifeless girl, and she came alive. He touched people. He loved people. He connected with people. I was just thinking, when he came alive and he was in that garden, and Mary recognized him, and Mary said, oh, Jesus, and she went to touch him and goes, oh, don't touch me just yet. I need to ascend and I'll come back. So touching was obviously so important to them. When Mary broke her alabaster box, she touched his feet and massaged them. So Jesus was all about touch. So there was 3 different things I wanted to look at. Okay? So what is it like to touch the untouchable? Touching the untouchable. In India, I was reading about this, and it just breaks my heart. But every society has untouchables. We're a broken world, and we all have untouchables in our world. That's been some of the problems that have happened, in the season of COVID. Some of these things have risen through racism in different countries and it's been so horrific in our own country as well, that there's people that we think less than. But in India, they have the whole caste system, and it starts with the Brahmins in the top and they work their way down. But there's this group of people, and it's something like 160 million people in India are called the untouchables. If they go into a restaurant, they have to drink from certain cups. They can't be in a place with other people. They have the lowest of the jobs. They're allowed, no law protects them from being beaten, from being raped, from horrible things happen to them. And nothing is there to protect these poor people. And in Jesus's day, there were untouchables. There was the lepers, those people with leprosy. And if you discovered you had leprosy, you had to go along to the synagogue. You showed them the spots on your hand, and they were like, yep, I can confirm it's leprosy. You went home, you said goodbye to your family, and you left. You went to live in a leper colony. And you had to go along, in those days, you had to go along with a bell, and you had to shout. If you were going into town to get some groceries, you would have to shout, unclean, unclean. You had to ring that bell. When people heard the bell, they were like, oh, there's lepers about. Where are they? Scatter, And it was just so horrific that they would do that. But they had no cure. They didn't know what else to do. And they lived in isolation. And these people, they maybe could see their families from afar, but they weren't able to touch them again. They moved into a society where they were never touched again. They were never handled again or anything. And I just love the fact that, along comes Jesus, and Jesus sees this leper, and this leper, shouts out, Jesus, Jesus, will you heal me? And I just find it interesting, that this man who was an outcast from society had heard about Jesus. So although he was in a leper colony, they heard, and can you imagine the conversation, do you think he would ever heal us? Do you think he would? I don't think he would come here. He's not going to come here because he might get infected. And so this brave leper goes to Jesus. You can hear people say, go away, and he's had to ring that bell and say he's here and he's approaching. And Jesus could have seen him coming and saying, okay, stop, I'm going to heal you, and in my name you're healed. But it doesn't say that. It says that Jesus went and touched him. Can you remember many years ago when the whole AIDS pandemic was around, and people were scared to touch people because of AIDS? And remember Princess Diana, she went into the hospital and she sat by an AIDS victim and she held their hand. And that act of kindness and that act of humanity dispelled so much. The power of touch just changed everything. And then people realized, you can't catch AIDS by touching people. And that's what Jesus did. He came right down to them and he said, I'm going to touch you. I'm going to hold on to you. And that's what he did. He also healed him. But I just think that's what Jesus did. He came to touch the untouchables. And he touched this man, and this man was healed. It says in Mark 1:41, Jesus, being deeply moved with tender compassion, Jesus reached out and touched the skin of the leper and told him, of course I want you to be healed, so now be cleansed. And there was more. This leper needed the human touch, but he was touched by Jesus and he was healed. And he now was able to then go and tell them, I've been healed. And I'm sure when he went back, I'm sure there was many lepers came and also were healed. And that leper was able to then be able to speak, be able to enter society again and be normal again and come out of isolation and come out of all of that. And I think it was just wonderful. There's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful story that I wanted to share with you. And it happens again in India. It's in 1967. There was a guy called Doug Nichols, and he was on a mission trip. And on this mission trip to India, an American guy, on this mission trip to India, he became very unwell. And he became very unwell with I can't remember what it was, but he became very unwell, and he was actually he actually developed tuberculosis, TB. So he became very unwell and had to come out of the mission trip and was put into this sanatorium and this very poor hospital in India. And he went there with his Bible tracts and he goes, oh, well, Lord, maybe you want me to hand out my missionary tracts and my stories to everybody in the place. So he went in and he took up his position in one of these beds in this very filthy hospital, and he tried to give the doctors and the nurses some of his tracts, and nobody was interested. And he said they actually almost despised him being there, because they thought, you're a wealthy American, what are you doing taking up one of the beds in our poor hospital that could serve someone else? And he thought, well, and he prayed for people and he tried to give them his tracts, but nobody was really interested. And one night he woke up, coughing in the middle of the night, as you do when you have TB, and he looked across at an old man in the bed opposite him. And this old man was lying in his bed and struggled to get up and tried to stand and couldn't stand and tried again. And he just watched the man, and then the man fell back and just fell asleep crying. And he watched the whole thing. And he said the place was such a horrible stench in the ward. And he said the next day he realized what had happened, that this poor old man who was very, very ill was trying to get to the toilet, and he had actually tried to sit up and go to the toilet, and he didn't have the energy, and so he actually wet himself and soiled himself. And he watched this happen again and again. The nurses came in and they shouted at him, and he watched one nurse slap him, and they changed his bed sheets, and he was crying, and the other patients were shouting at him and saying, you smelly person. And it was just so horrible. And the next night the same. This happened 2 or 3 nights, and he saw this man, and he watched him one night, and he thought, let's see what I can do to help. Let's see what I can do. And he got up and he went across, and he picked up the man, and the man looked with fear, and he picked up the man and he carried him. He put his arms under him and carried him to the toilet. And then he said that he held the man, because there was just a hole in the ground. He held the man and allowed the man to go to the toilet, and he cleaned himself up and took him back to bed. And the man kissed his cheek and said something in Indian which the American didn't understand, and he went back to his bed. And he said the next day he woke up, and one of the other patients came and gave him a cup of tea, and he thought, oh, a little bit of breakthrough here. And then later on, one of the doctors had heard what he had done, and the doctor came and said, oh, what are those tracts you had? What about that story you were giving? I wouldn't mind seeing one of those. And because he put himself out of his way to pick up the man, to take the man to the toilet, and to allow him to go to the toilet and have some dignity in his life, that act of humanity, that act of touched the whole ward. And suddenly everyone in the ward wanted to know what was the power that was in that man that allowed him to go beyond the smell, beyond the pain and everything, to pick up this man. And he said every night he would go and pick up the man, he would call him, and he would carry him and take him to the toilet. And that's what touching people is about. It's crossing those lines. It's crossing over to people who have never been touched by the love of God, who don't know anything. It's taking that meal to someone. It's loving on someone. It's being kind to someone. That's what we exist for. We exist to love people. We exist to be kind to people. And when we are, people go, what is it about you? Do you go to church or something? Is there a Jesus you serve? What makes you tick? It's not natural for us to think about other people. We're born as selfish human beings. You look at every child, it's me first. It's all about me. Every child, their answer is no, and it's all about me, and they're selfish. And we are all selfish in the core. But when we ask Jesus to take over our core, and we ask Jesus to come and say, there's more to life than this. The verse in the Bible, it says, it's more blessed to give than receive. And when you start loving on people and you start giving to people, your tank gets really full and things happen. And I just think it was just so amazing that story happened with that man. And it said, what made the difference when so many people responded that had rejected his literature? The difference was he had touched a man that everybody else had avoided, and he changed the lives of everybody in that ward. You see, God perhaps allowed him to have TB, allowed him to go into that ward, not to give out tracts, but to demonstrate his love. We will bring people on the journey when we demonstrate God's love, when we demonstrate his love through touching, through seeing, through hearing, through doing different things. When we do that, we will bring people on the journey with us. The second thing I wanted to speak about was what happens when, that was Jesus touching the untouchable. What happens when, you just think, oh, Jesus isn't here. I would love him to touch me, but I just need to touch him. And I was thinking about the woman with the issue of blood. She didn't feel she was good enough. There's that story in the Bible. Jesus was actually on his way to Jairus to heal Jairus' daughter. He was actually going somewhere, but he allowed himself to be interrupted. And I just wanted to say, we sometimes can go out of our way to touch people's lives, but how many times do we allow ourselves to be interrupted and allow people to encroach on our timetable? And I'm talking really to myself here, because sometimes I'm in a mission, I've got a list of things to do. How many times do I stop and say, you know what, let myself be inconvenienced to be able to touch you? And so this woman, had this issue of blood. She had had such a hard 12 years. I don't know if she had been married, but she certainly wouldn't have been intimate for 12 years, because in those days, when you were on your period, you actually were unclean. And so you had to walk away, you were unclean, nobody wanted anything to do with you, and it was really difficult. So this woman she wouldn't have been allowed to go to the temple, she wouldn't have been allowed to go to the women's court, she wouldn't have been allowed to cook food because she was unclean. So although she didn't have a disease like leprosy, she was still seen as unclean. And so this woman finds herself in this situation, and she's hearing the stories about Jesus healing people, Jesus loving on people, Jesus doing things, and she thinks, I don't know if I could come forward, because I heard, when people went forward and said, Jesus, could you heal me? He goes, what is it you want me to do? And they'd be saying, well, I'm blind. Can't you see? Can you heal my sight? And you can imagine her thinking, well, if I go to Jesus and he says, what's wrong with you? I'd have to say, I can't stop bleeding. It would be so embarrassing. How could I tell everybody? And then everybody round about me, would look on and say, why have you left your house? You're unclean. Why have you contaminated us? You can imagine all those fears she must have thought, all those anxieties, all those worries she had. And that she thought, you know what? I have to. Something compels her. And she goes and she loses herself in the crowd. She probably covered herself well. And it says that she crawled forward and she just touched the hem of his garment, just one touch. But Jesus knew power had gone, because he knew that her healing had happened. And it hadn't happened because he had touched her. It had happened because she had touched him. And I just think that's so powerful, that because he allowed himself to be inconvenienced, that he had a moment with her. She might have never been able to go and gather. She might not have been able to go and listen to him in a big gathering. But when there was a crowd, she was able to slip in and reach out and touch the hem of his garment. And because she touched him, she was healed. And I just think it's so powerful. Suddenly that touch totally changed her future. She was suddenly not ostracized anymore. She was able to go along to Sisterhood. She was able to go to the supermarket with her friends. She was able to prepare meals and have family round, because she was no longer untouchable. She was no longer ostracized. And that's what happens when Jesus comes and he allows himself to be inconvenienced and we get to spend time with him. And that one touch completely changed her whole future. And he brought her forward. And, he could have just said nothing. And she had her healing. And when Jesus said, who touched me? She could have thought, well, I'm certainly not putting my hand up. I'll just slip away. Nobody will know. I know I have been healed, because she immediately sensed that she had dried up, that the bleeding had stopped. So she immediately knew. But that courageous bit of her thought, right, okay, in for a penny, in for a pound, and she puts her hand up. And he brings her forward, not to humiliate her, not to condemn her, not to say, why didn't you speak up and ask me? Why did you touch me? He brings her forward to let everybody know that she is healed, that she is whole, that she is accepted, that she is cleansed, that she is restored. And her courage and bravery had changed her destiny. And that's what Jesus does. He allows himself to be inconvenienced. Aberdeen, but he wants to say to each one of you girls, you know, if he was here, he'd say, you know what? You are my special girl. You are the one I love. You are the one, I think you're great. I think you're accepted. I think you're loved. I think you're brave. And that's what Jesus would say if he was here. He would raise you up and change your future to say, there's more to you than just this. And the third thing I'd wanted to mention is maintaining touch in the world we live in. You know, I know there are many restrictions on us. Yes, we can't go. It seems crazy that I can't have my daughters come to my house, but we can all meet downtown and go to Pret for a cup of coffee. It doesn't make sense to me, but they're the guidelines and we're going to adhere to them. But in this season of isolation, when we can't physically touch, we can text, we can email, we can do all sorts of things. You know, when the church was when the church was started at the beginning in Acts, it said that the apostles, the people in charge after Jesus had gone back, they were so engaged with people. They would be going around saying, do you have enough food? If you don't have enough food, let me share my food with you. Do you have enough clothes? They were constantly in touch with everyone, constantly seeing how they were. How are you doing? Have you enough food? Are you ill? Do you need to go to the doctors? They were constantly there looking after everybody. And that's what it was. It says in John 15, 1-5, and I thought I just wanted to end with this here. In John 15, 1-5, it says, Jesus is speaking, I am the true sprouting vine, and the farmer who tends a vine is my Father. He cares for the branches connected to me by lifting and propping up the fruitless branches and pruning every fruitful branch to yield a greater harvest. The words I have spoken over you have already cleansed you. So you must remain in life union with me, for I remain in life union with you. For as a branch is severed from the vine, for as a branch that is severed from the vine will not bear fruit, so your life will be fruitless unless you live your life intimately joined and touched to me. And you know, at the beginning, like I said, the church was so connected with everybody. The church was there looking after everyone. And that's how it was meant to be. And you know, then the disciples, you know, when the persecution came and they were scattered and they went across to Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the world. And you know, Paul and some of the disciples got in boats and they went to Greece and Turkey and Iran and Italy and places like that, telling all the good news. They kept in touch. They would write letters. You know, I'm coming. I hope you're doing well. This is my letter to you, and I'm sending someone to keep in contact with you. I'll send someone to preach to you and to help you with this problem. They were constantly in touch, and that's why Paul made so many missionary journeys. Not because he was a world traveler, because he would start all these little churches, and then he would go back to check on them, and then go back again, because that's how it was. And you know, then the church went through for about, they're called the Dark Ages. The church suddenly, history shows that the church suddenly became very isolated, and the church, you know, a few hundred years after Jesus was here, the church then suddenly hid itself in monasteries, and the church for about 1,000 years, the church was almost silent. They lived their holy little lives inside these monasteries, never growing, just looking after their only little private club. And you know, if you take a connection, and if you take a battery out of a toy, and you hope that the toy works, it's just not going to work. It needs to be connected to the source. You know, if you take a plug out, I put my straighteners on this morning, I thought it's not working, and then I realized somebody had put the switch off, because I always leave it on, and I realized, oh, that little switch connected me to the power. We need to be connected to the source all the time through this thing about pruning. You know, we are on the tree of life. We're on Jesus's tree. We need to stay connected with him, stay connected through our reading our Bible, stay connected through sisterhood, stay connected with each other through sending a text, through a WhatsApp, through meeting people. We have to be connected. We were born for connection. We were born to be like that. And so now I'm glad I didn't live in the Dark Ages when the church was hidden behind monasteries and high buildings. I'm glad that the church is out there. You know, and it's interesting in this season where the church has had to close its doors. And I've loved the fact that the church building has shut, but the Church of Jesus has never shut. And we are in this whole city. We're out there touching lives, talking to people. It's been fun meeting back in our small groups in Sisterhood, and also at the prayer meetings on Monday, to see people who are actually coming back and saying, oh, I actually joined your church during lockdown. I didn't even know they were part of the church, but they have joined through lockdown. It's been vital that as a church that we have thought, right, as well as just being inside, let's go live, let's do things live. That's why we put this together and thought, okay, we were filming it, let's gather again, let's come together again, let's put it out there and make ourselves uncomfortable standing in front of a film crew. You know, I'm so wary. Some of the things I share, I sometimes say things that are wrong or misquote things. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I have to be really careful now because it's going live and I could get death threats because I've given wrong information. But you know, we just have had to be a little bit more accountable. And so it's been good. So this season of lockdown has produced its own unique fruit and its own unique things that's happened. And so let's not forget this. So in this season of lockdown, let's always keep in touch. No touch means no power. So no touch in our lives means no power. If we are not connected to Jesus, if we are not connected by maintaining that flow, then we will lose power. We will lose those different things. And I think everything, you know, when Jesus was here, you know, he touched the water and it was turned into wine. He looked at the disfigured people and he was able to call forth beauty. He was able to touch people and change their destinies. And I think we have to be so careful here. I was reading about, you know, psychiatrists who were talking about the mental health, and they said, one psychiatrist said, you know, a very leading famous psychiatrist, he said, you know, I believe 9 out of 10 people who are locked up in institutions wouldn't be there if they'd had good connections with their family, good connections with parents, where communication was good and they were loved unconditionally. He said, I believe 9 out of 10 wouldn't need to be there if they'd had the power of touch in their life, if they'd had somebody touching their life on a regular basis and checking up on them. So that's where I wanted to end this little series on you know, on the senses. You know, I do think, you know, I grew up in a country where there was a lot of eye disease, and I grew up with a lot of blind people because the country I grew up in had a blind church and a blind school. And you know, I grew up with people like that, and they were some of the most talented, incredible people. They memorized many languages. They could hear things that were beyond I could never hear, because their other senses, I think, rise and become so much more finely tuned. So you can live without sight. You can live without hearing. As I'm discovering, as I'm getting deaf, as I get older, you can live, you know, I mean, I don't have a very good sense of smell. I told you that, and taste before. You can live without some of these things, but I think the human touch, I think the touch of connection, the touch of living, the touch of each other and keeping touch with the Lord is the most important thing. So that's why touch is the mother of all senses, okay? So I just wanted to finish that, and I'll hand back over to Ashlyn, and she can pray us out. And I just wanted to say, for the next 2 weeks, girls, don't forget, we do not have Sisterhood because the school holidays are on. And so, not that we're going anywhere on holiday, but all the children will be home. So for the next 2 weeks, we don't have Sisterhood. We will gather again when school comes back. It's a 20 anyways, 2 weeks, 3 weeks today? Yeah, you'll figure it out. You'll watch social media and you'll figure it all out there. But we've got a great next season planned, and we look forward to you joining us. So thank you so much for joining us at home, and thank you so much for joining us in the room. God bless you.